China has not fought a war since 1979. They have an army that's not fought a war. The American military has a lot of experience fighting wars. I'm not saying this is a good thing. The United States is like a cocked pistol, right? Chinese military, they haven't fought a war in a long time, and they would have to launch an amphibious operation, which is one of the most difficult military operations possible.
Right.
On top of that, the Americans are going to defend Taiwan. Joe Biden has said this 4 separate times. We are going to defend Taiwan. The Chinese elites I've talked to over time, they know full well we are going to defend Taiwan. The Japanese are going to defend Taiwan with us. The Australians are going to defend Taiwan with us. So if the Chinese launch an amphibious operation to try to capture Taiwan, they're going to do that in the face of American, Japanese, and Australian resistance.
And the Koreans.
And the South Koreans in all likelihood will be there too. The Chinese basically believe they own the South China Sea. And their neighbors around the South China Sea don't agree with them. This is what's going on with regard to the Filipinos and the Chinese. And the Americans have a deep-seated interest in making sure that the Chinese don't win against the Filipinos or any other country in the South China Sea, because the Americans want to make sure that China doesn't dominate the South China Sea. The Chinese, they basically believe they own the South China Sea. And their neighbors around the South China Sea don't agree with them. This is what's going on with regard to the Filipinos and the Chinese. Right? So I don't see where there's much room for an agreement here. I mean, hopefully I'm wrong. And I believe the Chinese are hardball players, right? I believe they will. I think that the Chinese are going to go to great lengths over time to dominate the South China Sea. And that's why if the Filipinos get into trouble, they have to turn to the Americans, because there's no way the Filipinos can stand up to the Chinese. That's why the Americans have to be there. See, my basic view of international politics is that great powers want to grab all of the possible power that is available to them. They want to maximize their power. I think that the Chinese are going to go to great lengths over time to dominate the South China Sea and not let the Americans continue to make this case that these are international waters and China can't do this and China can't do that. And they're going to want to dominate the South China Sea. And there's going to be pushback. And there's going to be pushback from the Americans, and there's going to be pushback from the Japanese, even though they're in Northeast Asia, and there's going to be pushback from the Indonesians, the Vietnamese, the Taiwanese, you name it, for understandable reasons. I think the greatest danger is in the South China Sea. I think a conflict in the South China Sea is more likely than a conflict in Taiwan. And if you look at what's been happening with regard to the Filipinos and the Chinese over control of small islands, small pieces of territory in the South China Sea, there is real potential for conflict there. And the Americans could get dragged in, because the Americans have a deep-seated interest in rectifying the imbalance of power between China on one hand and the Philippines on the other, so that the Chinese can't take advantage of the Philippines in the South China Sea. So if things begin to heat up between the Chinese and the Philippines, it would, I think, be the case that the Americans would move in to line up or ally themselves with the Filipinos against the Chinese.
With the potential.
China's a great power, and it's getting more and more powerful. And one of the results of all of this economic growth and the development of sophisticated technology in the civilian sector is that they're also applying that wealth and those sophisticated technologies to building quite formidable military capability. They're not there yet by any means. They don't equal the United States, but they're not that far away. And the Chinese are impressive, not to be underestimated. So they're going to have a lot of military power. And I think individually, there's no country in East Asia that can stand up to the Chinese, except maybe the Japanese. The Japanese, are quite formidable. But even there, I don't believe they're a match for the Chinese. And I think if you go down into Southeast Asia, there's no country there that, can stand up to all that military might that the Chinese are accumulating. This is the concern. And of course, that's why the Americans have to be there. There are three great powers in the system: the United States, China, and Russia. Russia is the weakest of those three great powers, and China is much more powerful than Russia and is likely to be more powerful than Russia over time. So from an American point of view, China is a peer competitor, Russia isn't. That means that we should focus laser-like on China, and we should do everything we can to pivot to Asia. Pivoting to Asia means pivoting away from Europe and pivoting away from the Middle East. We don't want trouble in the Middle East. We want to be able to focus on East Asia, where China is located, obviously, right? But the Middle East is now blown up on us, and we're deeply involved there. Although we're thankfully not doing the fighting, we're nevertheless deeply involved. We're deeply involved in the Ukraine war. And all of this is preventing us from focusing on East Asia and focusing on the China threat. China is going to rise to the point where it is a peer competitor of the United States. China and the United States are doomed to have an intense security competition if China continues to rise peacefully. From China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to dominate Asia. From China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to push the Americans out of Asia, to have their own Monroe Doctrine. If I were the national security advisor in Beijing, I would tell Xi Jinping, we got to work overtime to figure out how to establish hegemony in Asia, because it is clearly the best way to survive in the international system. We have to imitate the Americans. We've got to get them out of here, okay? So from the Chinese point of view, that makes sense. But from the American point of view, and certainly from the point of view of China's neighbors, it does not make good sense to have China as a regional hegemon.